an opportunity later on for some questions from the audience, but I know that Professor Krugman would like to make a few brief remarks.
Yeah, and I'm actually seriously brief remarks because I have no idea what people want to hear about it. And so I'll just talk for just a few minutes and then throw it open. And actually, I didn't know at all what I should talk about because I have the usual things that I talk about, and I'm a little tired of them, though probably you haven't heard everything. Let me just say a word about, I had to do something, right? It's philosophy, it's a philosophical society, and I guess it's not all what I would think of as philosophy, since I saw the S&M thing poster on there. But the one thing I would say, and then I'll throw it open. Obviously, I spend virtually all my time now thinking about this mess that we're all in, the slump, the financial crisis, all of the terrible things. It has been a terrible time, but it has also, I'm sorry to say, professionally been a really interesting time. So there is this part of me that as a human being and as a citizen of the world says, what an awful thing has happened. And there's a part of me that's sort of like an epidemiologist with a really interesting new disease, or a volcanologist with a really interesting volcanic eruption that's trying to study this. And one of the things that struck me that is something I've been kind of grappling with in trying to write about this, is that it's part of the problem we have is, now I do philosophy, is epistemological. Here we have this thing, which is the economy, the world economy, this is involving all of us. How do we think about something like that? What do we know and how do we know it? And you might think, oh, that's got to be a pretty, never mind, we just go out there and look at it. But it's not that easy, because first of all, it is the economy, which is pretty much society, which means it's immensely complicated. And anytime you pick out a particular set of facts to look at, you are making a choice. You're picking out some thread. Why should I be looking at employment numbers rather than sales of soft drinks, right? What is it that are the numbers I should be paying attention to? What do I even mean? So some of you probably know that we talk about unemployment, but what do we mean by unemployment? That's not such an obvious concept. In fact, the United States, at any rate, has 6 different definitions of unemployment. And so when you see someone saying the unemployment rate, they're actually talking about U3. Why should we be looking at U3? Should we be looking at U5? What should we be using? But even more than that, the question of what do you learn from what you see? And there are 2 extremes, one of which would be raw empiricism. Here's what we see now, maybe here's what we see in history. That turns out to be really problematic. If you think we can just look at the facts, then it doesn't work too well. For one thing, so you probably have heard, there was a story. It's not a particularly happy story, but rather infamously, 2 very good economists wrote a pretty bad paper. Carmen Reinhardt and Ken Rogoff, which unfortunately was, they're by far the worst work for either of them, but it was telling certain people what they wanted to hear. And so it was picked up and they got carried along by that wave, and then it got very embarrassing. And what that paper purported to show was a very strong correlation between high levels of debt and poor economic performance. It turns out that actually there were there was a small spreadsheet error. It was not a major thing. There was a larger question of how they had data and which data were in it. But the most important question was, okay, there is a correlation. It's not really as strong as they said, but there is a correlation. What causes what? Does high debt lead to poor economic performance, or does poor economic performance lead to high debt? And that's something you cannot really answer just by looking at the facts. So we've actually had a kind of object lesson. Now, I would argue bringing other evidence to bear, and as many people who've looked at this now have said, it's mostly that poor performance leads to high debt. The really high debt countries now that combine high debt with sustained bad performance are Japan and Italy. And it's pretty clear their problems don't start with the debt. Their debt stems from the problems. But that's the point is what we just had is kind of an object lesson in how just looking at the facts is not enough. On the other hand, we can try to say, let's reason from first principles. And there's a lot of people in economics who believe that first principles in economics consist of people are rational, homo economicus, and we should reason from that. And if it doesn't involve careful reasoning from how rational people, actually, it's a marker of that kind of work. If you can, the use of the word people is already a marker of not really being part of the faith. If you really believe in that stuff, you refer to agents. So if you see a paper that's talking about depressions, but somehow doesn't mention people, only mentions economic agents, then you already know which sect that writer belongs to. And if you believe that that's how you need to do economics, the first principles, you quickly reach the conclusion that basically depressions can't happen, or what's happening now can't really be what people, right? If rational people, after all, if faced with being unable to find a job and wanting to work, would clearly be willing to accept wage cuts cheerfully in order to get those jobs. And so the fact that wages aren't plunging means that unemployment must be voluntary. So this isn't a recession; it's just a big vacation. Okay, well we know that's not right. Although I think I know that's not right. How do I know that? Tough stuff. What's turning out is that to do useful analysis requires living in this kind of gray area of epistemology, where you look at facts, but you decide that the facts are not enough, and you think you know what the principles are, but the principles, although you do think about what would Homo economicus do here, that's not enough. That's not, because we know that you can't make sense of what you see out there. I think you can't make sense of what we see out there without saying that people maybe they're self-interested, maybe they are somewhat goal-oriented, but they're not perfectly rational. How do we decide on that spectrum in between letting the facts speak for themselves and starting with a theory that is a priori, that doesn't rely on the facts? Where in that middle ground is the right place to be? And of course, we all know the answer to that, which is it's where you yourself happen to be. Everybody in this debate knows that he or she has picked exactly the right mix of empiricism and a priori reasoning to get at the right place. The difference between everyone else doing this and me is that I actually am right. But it's amazing. It's a much harder issue than people imagine. And unfortunately, what happens when you have serious confusion over epistemology and then it collides with the real world of policy is that you have the people, actually still love that phrase from John Maynard Keynes he talked about madmen and authority. People in power, the madmen and authority can always find somebody with some fancy academic credentials to tell them what they want to hear. Difficult times, very exciting, very interesting. From my point of view, pretty gratifying. I think my side of these debates has been right about a lot of stuff, which is good to know. It's kind of an assurance that we actually do know something in this field. But on the other hand, very frustrating because by and large nobody pays any attention, and the policymakers go on and do what they want to do. But it's as I say, it's very interesting times. And for those of you who will be looking for jobs sometime in the near future, good luck. Okay, let's go over for questions. Thanks.
Just before you open the floor to questions, just to get the ball rolling, just now you've taken some highly technical concepts and you've tried to break them down and make them accessible for an audience. And a lot of your work would be highly technical, but then you similarly write a blog for the New York Times. How do you go about, and do you find it difficult to break down these technical academic concepts and make them accessible and appealing to a wider audience?
Yeah. So, the old joke about the tourist visiting New York City who asks an old man on the street, he's lost, and asks, how do I get to Carnegie Hall? And the man says, practice. And I think the way to do it is mostly to have tried many, many times. And I actually would love to see, I think we should have, we do have some writing courses for students, but I think the discipline of putting technical concepts in plain language is something that really needs to be taught. It becomes second nature, more or less. It still takes quite a lot of thinking to figure out how to do it, but it's just think about it. Think of the person you're writing for. Think about
so when I write for the Times, it's very good. The copy editors are a very good target audience because they are well-educated, smart, extremely literate people with no technical background whatsoever. So if Linda or Justin, my copy editors, don't understand what I'm saying, then that means I have failed. I need to rewrite that part. But think about the person, think about what he or she's likely to know. The person you're writing for, Times, is highly, well-educated, fairly sophisticated, but not at all technically inclined, or not in any way technically inclined in your field person typically in the northeastern United States, but not necessarily. But and think about it. Don't realize that I'm going on too much, but a jargon. It's not just that people don't know what the jargon means. If you're stuck with 800 words, you do not want, unless under very special circumstances, even to try and explain to them what the jargon means. Just find another way to say it. Most things don't require that you use the terms of art. They're very useful for inside discussion. And concrete examples, all these things, and also actually, I just had a conversation with a relative young man who's has to write his first magazine article. And he's saying, how do I do that? And it's and the answer is not only have something to say, have concrete examples, but also use the old U.S. Army method. You tell them what you're going to tell them, then you tell them, then you tell them what you told them. Read any of my columns, you'll see I actually do that. It's almost, it actually gets kind of funny if you start to look and realize I've done that every time. But it's a skill. I think it's an important skill. And among other things, it helps to, if you can't find a way to express in plain English, then maybe you actually don't know what you're talking about.
If they would like to ask a question on the floor, yes?
Two questions. One is Iceland at the moment. Its debt to GDP ratio is now lower than ours, and there's a conversation going on in one of the places, the Irish Economy blog, which you might read. And it's arguing counterfactual, but somehow Iceland took some step or did something, an option that was open to us that we didn't take. And had we taken it, everything would be so much better now. Do you really believe that there was a politically realistic option for us at some point that we could have taken that would have lessened the consequences? And then just a second question, slightly related. Why do you think the political consequences haven't been as dramatic for governments as the economic situation might suggest, and that it's the distributional aspects, like public versus private and pensioners versus young people, that are much more potent rather than a kind of left-right division in Western governments?
Okay, so I've got, I can go on probably far too long, but that's a really good question. So first, Iceland versus Ireland. Start with two things that were different. So I think I was one of the first certainly one of the first economists not at all close to Iceland to start to notice that there was something remarkable going on there. That Iceland, which was supposed to be at this point a smoking crater in the middle Atlantic, was actually managing to extricate itself from the crisis pretty well. Iceland had two things differed from Ireland in two important ways that did, in a funny way, work to Iceland's advantage. I'd say two primarily. One of which was, it's true that their economy is not as tightly integrated with the Eurozone, or in fact with the world, as Ireland. Even though it's a tiny, even though it's a tenth of the population, they're not a place that's engaged in a lot of value-added trade, where you import materials and then do something to them and then export them. And again, it's basically, once you take away the banking, it's an economy that sells aluminum, fish, and tourism. And that makes it a lot easier for them to have an independent currency, a floating exchange rate, even though they're such a tiny country. And Ireland is very much integrated, and arguably has therefore less flexibility. I think actually if Ireland had never joined the euro, you would have found that you had more flexibility than you think, but still, it makes a difference. Then the second thing is Ireland did join the euro, and the question about whether to be in or not is very different from the question of whether to leave once you're in. So it would have been highly disruptive economically had Ireland left the euro, it would have been politically a big deal. And in fact, realistically, if we're talking about political realism, there was never any chance that Ireland was going to leave the euro.